The year was 1971. President Richard Nixon stood before television cameras and delivered a speech that would reshape the global economy forever. He suspended the convertibility of dollars to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system that had anchored international finance since World War II. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a structural design far more ambitious and far more fragile. Within 3 years, the United States had struck a deal with Saudi Arabia that would create the most powerful monetary system in modern history. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth would be priced in dollars. Every nation that wanted energy would need American currency. It was brilliant. It was unprecedented, and it gave Washington power that no empire had ever wielded before. But here's the structural flaw they didn't tell you about that system. You've been operating under the illusion that you're simply paying bills, saving for retirement, or managing a career. That's the lie. The brutal, unspeakable truth is that for the last 50 years, your productivity and your debt have been the fuel for an empire's final, unsustainable binge. You feel that exhaustion, that constant pressure to stay on the treadmill? That's not a personal failure. That is the brutal sentence of the debt structure, where you are the final collateralized asset, and your life savings are the final payment on a 50-year-old agenda you never voted for, built on a promise the elite always intended to break. What you call savings is merely a deferred tax on the most elegant financial collapse in modern history. The game was rigged in 1971, but the trap wasn't fully set until 1974. You must understand this historical precision, because it is the structural logic that determines your financial fate today. We begin not with conjecture, but with the cold, hard data of imperial overreach. In 1944, 44 Allied nations convened at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The agreement was a compromise, a peace treaty structure. The world's currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar in turn would be redeemable for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This was the foundation of post-war stability. America's industrial might and gold reserves, the most massive in world history, gave it the sovereign anchor. But this very anchor introduced the fatal contradiction that would ultimately doom the system. The dollar had to be simultaneously scarce to maintain gold convertibility and abundant to finance global trade and America's imperial obligations. As the economist Robert Triffin observed in the 1960s, a moment of true prophetic clarity. The country running the world's reserve currency would eventually be forced to choose between domestic stability and global dominance. To fund the Vietnam War, the Cold War buildup, and massive social spending, the US kept the printing presses running, exporting dollars far in excess of its gold reserves. This is the definition of imperial overstretch, a phenomenon documented across history from the late Roman Empire, whose debasement of the denarius became a direct reflection of its expanding military needs, to the Spanish Empire, whose reliance on New World silver ultimately funded inflation and economic decay at home. The elite, specifically the French, saw the deception first. President Charles de Gaulle, in his cynical political wisdom, famously called the arrangement the exorbitant privilege, a system that allowed the US to run deficits and pay for imports with paper promises, while other nations had to earn gold. De Gaulle, in a direct strategic act, began demanding gold in exchange for dollars, draining Fort Knox. By August 15, 1971, the choice was made. President Richard Nixon went on national television and unilaterally suspended the gold convertibility of the dollar, officially ending Bretton Woods. This was the structural break. It was a desperate move of financial sovereignty, tearing up an international treaty, but it saved the immediate domestic political system. The fatal question remained: if the world's reserve currency was no longer backed by gold, what was it backed by? The answer, for the subsequent 3 years, was nothing but pure, unadulterated trust, a political liability that could not stand. The elite needed a new anchor, a resource every single nation, ally or enemy, required. They needed energy. The Kissinger-Nixon administration recognized the perfect window of opportunity opened by the 1973 oil embargo. In a move of staggering, cold-blooded geopolitical precision, Henry Kissinger struck a secret deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974. The terms were simple and brutal. Saudi Arabia, the world's dominant oil exporter, would price all its oil sales exclusively in US dollars, and then recycle those petrodollars back into US Treasury securities and banks. In exchange, the US would guarantee the security and survival of the House of Saud. The petrodollar system was born. It was not a voluntary market agreement. It was a global protection racket enforced by the Fifth Fleet. It created an artificial mandatory demand for the dollar, the true sovereign anchor of the modern era. Every nation that wanted energy had to first acquire dollars. They had to perpetually export their goods and labor to America, or borrow dollars from American banks, just to buy oil. This is how the system extracted the value of your labor globally, not through conquest, but through a currency loop. This is the moment the debt clock began ticking for every American citizen. The brilliance of this structural design was that it solved Triffin's dilemma. The US could run massive, unprecedented budget and trade deficits because the rest of the world was forced to finance them. Dollars flowed out to pay for wars and imports, then flowed right back in as investment, funding the debt. It was the ultimate unearned fiscal license. The unearned fiscal license. And it provided 50 years of consumption that the American economy never actually earned. This system, however, contained a hidden, ticking time bomb. The moment the US used this financial power as a weapon, the rest of the world would have an existential incentive to build an alternative. The petrodollar's fatal contradiction was triggered the moment the dollar became a geopolitical bludgeon. The sanctions imposed on nations like Iran, and more recently and dramatically Russia, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, served as a global cynical announcement. Compliance with US foreign policy is mandatory, or your sovereign assets can be instantly frozen, and your access to the global payment system SWIFT can be revoked. This wasn't just punishment for Moscow. It was a demonstration of absolute power that terrified every central bank, from Beijing to Brasilia, to this fear instantly catalyzed a strategic confrontation. China, understanding that control over energy and payments is the foundation of sovereignty, has positioned itself to dismantle the illusion of stability. They are executing a methodical, historical countermove, a modern-day currency war that doesn't involve tanks, but trade settlement. The launch of the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, INE, crude oil futures contracts, priced in yuan and reportedly redeemable for physical gold, is an empirical example of this strategy. This is a direct structural bypass of the dollar, a return to commodity-backed money, but with Beijing holding the keys. We are seeing a cyclical phenomenon. The challenger empire, facing the incumbent, establishes a rival trade network based on hard, tangible, real assets. In the 18th century, the British Navy enforced the sterling's gold backing. Today, the structural logic of trade dictates a movement away from unsecured paper. The emerging multipolar structure is not a theory, it is documented, observable fact. Nations forming the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively developing parallel payment systems and currency swap agreements. India, the world's most populous nation, has been quietly establishing rupee trade accounts with multiple nations, systematically reducing its dollar dependence for critical oil imports. This movement is a direct response to the weaponization of the dollar, confirming the prediction of cynics like Jacques Rueff, who saw the Bretton Woods system as inherently flawed and due for an inevitable, dramatic collapse once trust evaporated. The velocity of this historical shift is accelerating. Dollar reserves held by central banks have already fallen significantly, a geological shift in finance that signals a crisis of confidence. What the masses don't grasp is that the collapse isn't a slow drift. It is a rapid, non-linear cascade once the psychological threshold of trust is crossed. The inescapable consequence of 50 years of financial engineering, the illusion of perpetual growth, fueled by debt and deficits, has created a maximal dependency structure. You have been forced to pursue abundance at all costs, only to find yourself trapped by the very rules meant to elevate you. The system requires you to be leveraged, reliant on subsidized goods, and chained to a mortgage or a job that funds the whole apparatus. The master plan for resistance is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It is an antidote rooted in strategic stoicism, a defense against the psychological manipulation of the system. The only way to survive the system's final, violent attempt to extract value is to actively pursue minimal dependency. The Stoic antidote is the relentless and disciplined reduction of your external surface area of vulnerability. It's the intellectual resistance against the illusion of abundance. When the empire collapses, the man who is debt-free, who controls tangible assets outside the immediate jurisdiction of the collapsing fiscal regime, and who can function with limited reliance on the import-export economy, is the only sovereign who remains. This requires a ruthless, cynical strategy. Prioritize the acquisition of real assets and actively dismantle your debt structure. The final lesson of history is that the prepared cynic doesn't fear the storm. They treat it as a mandatory economic clearing event. The collapse is a necessary and painful clearing of the field, creating a new foundation based on scarcity and tangible value. This is your chance to be the architect, not the collateral. The vast majority will be crushed by the gravity of the empire's final payment. They will wait for a solution from the very system that engineered the problem. That is the definition of fatal naivete. Your choice is simple. Will you be the final invoice, or the architect of your own refuge? This is not the moment for hope, but for structural design. If you chose to see the logic of collapse, your immediate strategic task is identifying where the next hidden lever of control is being positioned. The world is being remade, and you need the strategy for the new scarcity. Join the few who chose to see the structure. I'll wait for you here with the strategy. If you are ready for the next level of clarity, for the structural analysis that turns data into action, you need to understand the master plan for the new debt economy. Click on the video appearing now